Black man Anthony gave food to a desperate woman, Monique. The next day, he became a billionaire. Anthony Jones was an ordinary man, living in a small apartment in the bustling city. He worked a modest job as a security guard at a local warehouse, earning just enough to pay his bills. Life had been tough, and Anthony often found himself struggling to make ends meet. Yet, despite his hardships, he was a kind-hearted man, always willing to help others when he could. One cold evening, as Anthony walked home after a long shift, he noticed a woman sitting on a bench by the park. She was wrapped in a thin, tattered coat, shivering from the cold. Her face looked pale, and her eyes carried a deep sadness. Anthony's heart went out to her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, approaching her. "Are you all right?" The woman, Monique, looked up at him with teary eyes. I'm just hungry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I haven't eaten in days." Without hesitation, Anthony reached into his bag and pulled out the sandwich he had saved for his dinner. It wasn't much, but he handed it to Monique. "Here, take this," he said with a smile. Monique hesitated, her hands trembling, but eventually, she took the sandwich. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "You're the first person who's shown me kindness in a long time." Anthony stayed with her for a while, making sure she was all right before leaving. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about Monique, but he didn't dwell on it too much. Little did he know, that small act of kindness would change his life forever. The next morning, Anthony woke up to a strange buzzing sound. His phone, which rarely rang, was going off continuously. Groggy and confused, he picked it up, only to hear the excited voice of his friend Jamal. "Anthony, man, are you seeing this? You're all over the news." Anthony frowned, sitting up in bed. "What are you talking about?" "Check the headlines. Some anonymous billionaire just left you a fortune." Jamal's voice was practically shaking with excitement. Anthony's heart raced as he quickly opened his phone's browser. His eyes widened as he saw the headline. "Local man Anthony Jones receives billions from mysterious donor." He blinked, certain it was a mistake. There had to be another Anthony Jones. But as he read further, his picture appeared in the article. Anthony Jones, a humble security guard, woke up to find an unimaginable fortune deposited into his account. The donor remains unknown, but records show the transfer was legitimate. Anthony dropped his phone in shock. Was this real? He quickly logged into his bank app, and his jaw dropped at the sight of numbers he had never seen before. $1 billion. Was this some kind of joke? He didn't know any rich people, and certainly no one would just give away that kind of money. His mind raced back to the woman he had helped the night before. Monique. Could this have something to do with her? But how? Still in disbelief, Anthony decided to take the day off from work. He needed time to process this surreal event. The news quickly spread through the neighborhood, and soon, everyone was calling and texting him, asking if it was true. The media began camping outside his apartment, hoping to catch a glimpse of the new billionaire. Unable to avoid the attention, Anthony reached out to a financial advisor. He needed to know if this was a mistake or some kind of scam. The advisor, after reviewing all the documents, confirmed that the money was indeed his. "This kind of thing doesn't happen often," the advisor said, "but it's legitimate. Whoever this donor is, they wanted you to have this money." Anthony sat back, still processing the shock. But he couldn't help but think about Monique. Was she the key to all of this? He decided to return to the park where he had met her, hoping to find her again. The park was quiet, and the bench where she had sat was empty. He asked a few people around if they had seen her, but no one seemed to know anything. As the day went on, Anthony began to wonder if Monique was even real. What if she had been some sort of angel or spirit sent to test him? Or was this just a coincidence? Regardless, he knew his life had changed overnight, and he needed to figure out what to do next. Days passed, and Anthony was slowly adjusting to his new reality. The influx of wealth had turned his life upside down. He had moved into a luxurious apartment downtown and hired a team of advisors to help him manage his sudden fortune. Still, in the midst of it all, he couldn't shake the thought of Monique. Who was she? Was she somehow connected to this miracle? One morning, Anthony received an envelope in the mail, unlike any he had seen before. It was elegantly designed with gold trim, and the handwriting was beautiful, almost too perfect. With a mixture of curiosity and nervousness, he opened it. Inside was a simple note that read, _Anthony, your kindness did not go unnoticed. The world rewards those who act with a pure heart. But remember, wealth comes with responsibility. Your journey has only just begun. Trust your instincts and never forget where you came from. If you seek answers, come to the Willow Cafe at 6 p.m. tomorrow. There was no signature. His mind raced. Could this be connected to Monique? Was she behind the sudden fortune? The letter gave him no real answers but raised countless questions. Why was he chosen? Who was watching him? And what did they want from him now? Anthony decided he had no choice but to follow the instructions. The next day, he headed to Willow Cafe, a small, quiet spot he had visited a few times in the past. At exactly 6 p.m., he stepped inside, scanning the room for anyone who might stand out. There, sitting by the window, was Monique. Anthony approached her slowly, his heart racing. Monique looked up from her cup of tea, and her expression was soft but mysterious. She gestured for him to sit. "You came," she said, her voice just as gentle as it had been that cold night in the park. "I knew you would." Anthony sat down, unable to hide his curiosity any longer. "Was it you?" he asked bluntly. "Did you send me that money?" Monique smiled faintly, but didn't answer right away. Instead, she sipped her tea, her eyes gazing out of the window for a moment. "Anthony, there are things in this world that can't be explained so easily. Sometimes, the universe has a way of rewarding those who do good, even when they expect nothing in return." Anthony shook his head, frustrated by the vagueness. "But why me? I gave you a sandwich. That's all I did." She finally met his eyes, her expression turning serious. "What you gave me that night was more than just food. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that kindness still exists in a world that often forgets it. And sometimes, hope is worth more than gold." Anthony leaned in closer, still unsatisfied. "That doesn't explain how I ended up with $1 billion in my bank account overnight." Monique chuckled softly. "You'll find that life has many layers, Anthony. Not everything can be explained in dollars and cents. The real question is, what will you do with it?" Anthony fell silent, pondering her words. She was right. He hadn't thought much about how he would use the money. Until now, it had all felt like a dream. Before he could ask more, Monique stood up. "I'll be around when you're ready to learn more. But remember, Anthony, you've been given a gift, and gifts come with expectations." She placed her hand on his shoulder briefly, then walked out of the cafe, leaving Anthony sitting there with more questions than answers. Anthony couldn't shake Monique's cryptic words as he went about his day-to-day life. The initial excitement of becoming a billionaire was starting to wear off, replaced by a nagging sense of responsibility. He had been given more money than he knew what to do with, but what was he supposed to do with it? As weeks passed, Anthony's wealth began to attract all kinds of people. Old friends he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reached out, asking for help. Some were genuine, but others seemed to want nothing more than a piece of his fortune. It didn't take long for Anthony to realize that money could change the way people treated him, and not always for the better. One afternoon, while going through his finances with his advisor, something caught his attention. A portion of his funds had been quietly redirected to a charity for homeless shelters across the city. He hadn't authorized it, but the donation had his name on it. Confused, he called his advisor. "I didn't make this donation," Anthony said. "How did this happen?" The advisor paused before responding. "It was arranged through your anonymous benefactor. They said it was part of the agreement." "Agreement?" Anthony echoed, confused. "What agreement?" But the advisor didn't have any answers. The situation was getting stranger by the day. Later that evening, Anthony received another letter, just like the first. This one was even more mysterious. "The world is watching, Anthony. The path you choose will define your future. Not all wealth is measured in money. Tomorrow brings more than just fortune. It brings choices. Be wise. Anthony felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that his journey was far from over. Whatever he had stumbled into was much bigger than he could have imagined. Anthony could feel the weight of the letter in his hands. even though it was just a thin piece of paper. The words kept echoing in his mind. Underscore tomorrow brings more than just fortune. It brings choices. Underscore what choices? What was expected of him now? The following morning, Anthony received an unexpected visit. A sleek black car pulled up outside his new apartment, and a man in a tailored suit stepped out. He knocked on the door with an air of authority, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Jones, I presume?" the man said when Anthony opened the door. "My name is Mr. Turner. I represent a private organization that has been monitoring your progress." Anthony's brow furrowed in confusion. "Monitoring my progress? What do you mean?" Mr. Turner smiled faintly. "You've recently come into a large sum of money, thanks to our benefactor. But the money is only the beginning. You've been chosen for something far greater." Anthony stepped back, feeling uneasy. "Chosen for what?" Mr. Turner entered the apartment, uninvited, and handed Anthony a folder. "Inside, you'll find the details. You've been selected to be part of an elite group of individuals, those with the power to change the world. But in exchange for the fortune, there are responsibilities." Anthony hesitated before opening the folder. It contained documents outlining a secretive organization called the Circle, a group of wealthy philanthropists who operated in the shadows, pulling strings and influencing global events. It was all overwhelming. Why had they chosen him, a simple security guard, for something so monumental? "You expect me to join this?" Anthony asked, his voice shaky. "What if I say no?" Mr. Turner's smile faded. "Saying no isn't as simple as you think, Mr. Jones. This isn't just about you anymore. Your wealth is tied to this group now. Every decision you make moving forward has consequences, on a scale you can't even imagine." Anthony felt a cold sweat forming on his brow. "And if I refuse?" Turner's eyes darkened. "That would be unwise." With that, the man turned and left, leaving Anthony standing alone in his luxurious apartment, the folder clutched tightly in his hands. He had always believed that wealth brought freedom, but now it seemed like his newfound fortune had come with invisible chains. For days, Anthony tried to push the encounter with Mr. Turner to the back of his mind. He didn't want to believe that his life had been manipulated by forces beyond his control. But no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, something in him knew that he couldn't escape. The wealth that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a burden. Another letter arrived at his doorstep, this time with explicit instructions. Underscore, your first task is simple, Anthony. You must donate 20% of your wealth to a cause of your choosing. However, it cannot be one that benefits you directly. Consider this your initiation into the circle. The clock is ticking. Underscore. Anthony crumpled the letter in frustration. Who were these people to dictate how he used his money? But as much as he wanted to defy them, he also knew that the circle wasn't a group to take lightly. Their reach was far too powerful, their influence far too widespread. He sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, trying to figure out how to proceed. He thought back to Monique's words at the cafe. Under wealth comes with responsibility. Underscore, maybe this was what she had meant all along. But something about this didn't sit right with him. The circle's intentions seemed to go beyond simple philanthropy. What if their cause wasn't as noble as they made it seem? After hours of pondering, Anthony decided to take matters into his own hands. Instead of donating the money to some high-profile charity that the circle might expect, he reached out to a small, struggling community center he had once volunteered at. The center was on the brink of closing, and his donation would make a real impact on the lives of people in need. It felt like the right decision, but as soon as he sent the funds, his phone rang. It was Mr. Turner. "Interesting choice, Mr. Jones," Turner said coolly. "A small local cause. It wasn't what we expected, but you fulfilled the task." Anthony breathed a sigh of relief. He had passed the first test, but he knew more would come. The real question was how far he was willing to go. Anthony's life became a balancing act between his newfound wealth and the demands of the circle. Each task they gave him was more challenging than the last, pushing him to make difficult decisions. Sometimes he was asked to help people in need, but other times the instructions were morally gray, forcing Anthony to question whether he was being used for something darker. His next task came in the form of a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a man, someone Anthony didn't recognize, and a brief note, underscore he owes a debt. Make sure it's paid. Underscore. Anthony stared at the picture, his heart racing. This was different. This wasn't about charity or wealth redistribution. It felt like the circle was asking him to play a dangerous game. But what kind of debt were they talking about? And how was he supposed to ensure it was paid? Conflicted, Anthony set out to find the man in the photo. His name was Marcus, and after some digging, Anthony discovered that he owned a failing business downtown. He owed money to the wrong people, and his life was spiraling out of control. Anthony wrestled with his conscience. He didn't want to be the circle's pawn, but he also couldn't deny that Marcus was in serious trouble. What was worse, refusing the circle's demands could put Anthony in jeopardy. After days of internal struggle, he made a decision that would change everything. He arranged a private meeting with Marcus, not to intimidate him, but to offer help. "I know about your debt," Anthony said. "Let me help you settle it." Marcus was skeptical, but Anthony's sincerity convinced him. With a portion of his wealth, Anthony paid off Marcus's debt, freeing him from the dangerous criminals who had been threatening his life. It was a risky move, but it felt like the right one. When the circle found out, they were not pleased. Mr. Turner appeared at Anthony's apartment that night, his expression unreadable. "You're walking a fine line, Mr. Jones," Turner warned. "This isn't about playing hero. There are rules." Anthony stared him down, refusing to back down. "I did what I thought was right." Turner's eyes narrowed. "Be careful. There are consequences for defiance." Anthony knew he had crossed a line with the circle. For days after his confrontation with Mr. Turner, there was an unsettling silence. No letters, no calls, nothing. It felt as though a storm was brewing, and Anthony was at its center, waiting for it to hit. He tried to continue his life as normally as possible. He spent his days overseeing new charitable projects and helping those in need, the kind of work he had always dreamed of doing. But a shadow loomed over him, the constant fear that the circle hadn't forgotten his defiance. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. One evening, as Anthony was about to leave his office, the phone rang. He hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was low and unfamiliar. "Mr. Jones, this is your final warning. You've gone too far. There's a price for going against us. We suggest you reconsider your next move, or the people you care about might pay for your mistakes." The threat was clear. Anthony's heart raced as he realized the gravity of his situation. The circle wasn't just a secretive organization with influence. They were dangerous. And now, they were coming for him. Anthony knew he had to act fast. He couldn't allow anyone he cared about to become collateral damage in the circle's twisted game. But where could he turn? The police wouldn't believe a story about a shadowy group pulling the strings behind the scenes, and exposing them could put him in even greater danger. That night, he paced his apartment, thinking through every option. One name kept resurfacing in his mind: Monique. She had been the one to set all of this in motion. Surely, she would have some answers. But could he trust her? The next morning, Anthony made his way to the park where he had first met Monique. He had no way of contacting her, no clue if she would even show up. But deep down, he felt certain she was still watching him, just as the circle was. Hours passed, and just as he was about to leave, Monique appeared, walking slowly toward him. She sat beside him on the bench, her expression calm and knowing. "I've been expecting you," she said quietly. Anthony turned to Monique, his voice filled with urgency. "They've threatened me, Monique. They've made it clear that if I don't follow their orders, the people I care about will suffer. I don't know what to do." Monique nodded, as if she had anticipated this. "I warned you, Anthony. Wealth comes with responsibility, and in your case, that responsibility comes with a price. The circle is not a group to be taken lightly. They control much more than you can imagine." "But why me?" Anthony asked, frustration evident in his voice. "I'm just a regular guy. I didn't ask for any of this." Monique's eyes softened. "No, you didn't. But your act of kindness set something in motion, something far bigger than either of us. The circle took notice of you because of your heart, because you represent something they fear, someone who can't be bought or controlled." They've tested you, and now they're trying to break you. Anthony ran his hands through his hair, feeling overwhelmed. So what am I supposed to do? If I keep following their orders, I lose myself. But if I refuse, they'll come after me and the people I love. Monique placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. There's always a way out, Anthony. But it won't be easy. The circle thrives on fear and control. You have to show them that you're not afraid, that you won't bend to their will. The moment they see that they can't break you, their power over you diminishes. Anthony looked at her, hope flickering in his eyes. How? How do I stand up to something so powerful? Monique stood up, her gaze distant as if she were looking beyond the park, beyond the world they knew. You'll need allies, people who have been hurt by the circle, just like you. Together, you can dismantle their influence. But you'll also need to be smart. The circle has eyes everywhere. One wrong move, and they'll retaliate. She handed him a small card with a single name and address written on it. This person can help you. They've been fighting the circle for years, but they've stayed in the shadows, waiting for someone like you to come along. Anthony looked down at the card, committing the name to memory. What about you, Monique? How are you connected to all of this? She smiled sadly. I've been where you are now, Anthony. I know what it's like to be caught in the circle's web. But I made my choices, and now I help those who are willing to fight back. You're not alone in this. Before Anthony could ask more, Monique stood up, walking away into the distance as the sun began to set. Anthony was left with the card in his hand and the weight of the choices ahead of him. Determined to break free from the circle's grasp, Anthony wasted no time. He followed the address Monique had given him, finding himself in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood far from the busy streets of the city. The house at the end of the block was small, with peeling paint and a neglected garden. It didn't look like the home of someone who had been waging a secret war against a powerful organization. He knocked on the door, half expecting no one to answer. But after a few moments, the door creaked open, and a man in his late 50s with graying hair and tired eyes stood before him. You must be Anthony, the man said, his voice rough but kind. Monique told me you'd come. Anthony nodded, stepping inside as the man led him to a cluttered living room. The walls were lined with old books, newspaper clippings, and photographs, all of them related to the circle. It was clear that this man had been tracking their movements for years. My name's Samuel, the man said, gesturing for Anthony to sit. I used to be one of them a long time ago, but like you, I made a choice. I refused to play by their rules, and I've been in hiding ever since. Anthony's eyes widened. You were part of the circle? Samuel nodded. Yes, and I know exactly how dangerous they are, but I also know their weaknesses. They rely on fear to control people, and once you stop being afraid, they lose their grip. Anthony leaned forward, his mind racing. So, what do we do now? How do we fight back? Samuel smiled grimly. We start by exposing them, one step at a time. Anthony sat across from Samuel, absorbing every word. The room was filled with an eerie silence as Samuel spread out maps, documents, and photos across the coffee table. Each piece of paper told a different story, but they all had one common thread: the circle's influence and its network of power. They operate under the radar, Samuel began, pointing to various locations marked on the map. You'll never see them in the open, but their reach is vast. Corporations, politicians, media. They control it all, but like any machine, there are cracks. If we can expose their inner workings, those cracks will widen. Anthony studied the map carefully. And what happens then? Exposing them could mean bringing down powerful people. Exactly, Samuel replied. People fear what they don't understand, and the circle has built its empire on secrecy. If we can pull back the curtain, make their actions public, they'll start to fall apart. But it's not going to be easy. You're going to need resources, people you can trust, and, most importantly, patience. Anthony nodded, understanding the magnitude of what lay ahead. I'll do whatever it takes. I can't keep living in fear. Samuel slid a manila folder across the table. Inside this folder are the names of those who've been wronged by the circle. Some of them are still loyal to the organization, but many of them, like you, want a way out. They're afraid to speak out, but if you can rally them, we'll have a better chance. Anthony opened the folder, scanning the list of names. Some were familiar, business owners, influential figures. Others were ordinary citizens who had been caught in the circle's web. How do I get in touch with them without tipping off the circle? Samuel tapped the side of his head. You'll need to be discreet. Start with those who are already close to you. Slowly build their trust, and when the time is right, approach them with what you know. But be careful. The circle has eyes everywhere. A sense of dread settled over Anthony. This wasn't just a battle against a shadowy organization. It was a battle for his life. One wrong step, and the circle would come down on him like a hammer. As he left Samuel's house that night, the weight of his decision settled heavily on his shoulders. He was no longer just a billionaire trying to do good in the world. He was now a man on a mission, caught in a dangerous game of cat and mouse. The following weeks were a blur of cautious planning and quiet observation. Anthony returned to his life as normal, but everything had changed. Every phone call, every meeting, every interaction now felt like a potential threat. He couldn't shake the feeling that the circle was watching his every move, waiting for him to slip up. He began reaching out to the names in Samuel's folder, carefully selecting those who seemed most likely to be allies. His first contact was a woman named Sylvia, a former journalist who had been blackballed after she tried to expose corruption in the city. She had lost everything, her career, her reputation, but she hadn't lost her will to fight. Anthony met Sylvia in a quiet cafe late at night. She was wary, her eyes scanning the room constantly as they spoke. You're playing a dangerous game, Anthony, she said, sipping her coffee. But if anyone can take them down, it's someone like you. Anthony leaned in, speaking in a low voice. I'm not asking you to risk everything again. I just need information, names, and connections. If we can show the world who they really are, we can bring them down together. Sylvia nodded, though hesitation flickered in her eyes. I'll help you. But you need to understand, the circle doesn't just destroy lives. They erase people. I've seen it happen. One day, you're a successful journalist, and the next, you don't exist anymore. They're ruthless. Anthony felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't let it show. I understand the risks. I'm not backing down. Sylvia handed him a small USB drive. This contains everything I gathered before they shut me down. Names, addresses, deals, secrets. Use it wisely. And Anthony, be careful. Once you start down this path, there's no turning back. As Anthony walked home that night, the streets seemed darker, the air thicker with tension. His mind raced with the possibilities of what could happen next. The USB drive felt like a ticking time bomb in his pocket. Valuable, but dangerous. Just as he reached his apartment, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. You're not as invisible as you think. His heart pounded. They were watching. They knew what he was doing. He quickly scanned his surroundings, but no one seemed out of place. The paranoia crept in, but he knew he couldn't afford to panic. He had to stay calm, stay focused. Inside his apartment, Anthony locked the door and sat down at his desk. He plugged the USB drive into his laptop, watching as the screen filled with files. Names, transactions, photos. It was all there, a web of corruption and deceit that stretched farther than he had imagined. But as he scrolled through the files, one name stood out: Monique. A photo of her appeared on the screen, along with a file detailing her involvement with the circle. Anthony's blood ran cold. Monique had been part of it all along. But what was her role? Was she playing him? Or was she trying to break free, just like him? He sat back, staring at the screen, torn between anger and confusion. Monique had set everything in motion, but now it seemed like she was more deeply entwined in this conspiracy than he had ever imagined. The revelation about Monique shook Anthony to his core. He couldn't believe she had been part of the circle from the beginning. Had she been manipulating him this whole time? Or was she a victim just like him? He needed answers, but approaching Monique directly was too dangerous. If she was still loyal to the circle, confronting her could spell disaster for his entire plan. But if she was trying to break free, like Samuel had said, she might hold the key to taking them down. As Anthony sat in his office the next day, his mind raced with questions. The stakes were higher than ever, and now, more than ever, he had to be careful about who he trusted. The next move would determine everything, whether he could dismantle the circle or fall victim to its deadly grip. Anthony spent the next few days in a whirlwind of emotions. The knowledge that Monique, the woman who had seemingly changed his life, was connected to the circle made his every move feel calculated. His trust in her had been absolute. She was the one who had been desperate and in need, yet she was deeply enmeshed in the very organization that now threatened him. He sat in his office, staring at the photo of Monique on his laptop screen. The USB drive Samuel had given him had more layers than he initially understood, and the secrets it held were darker than anything he could have imagined. There was a detailed report on Monique's life, including her finances, her family, and her role in helping the circle gain control of high-ranking officials. Why had Monique approached him that night, acting so helpless? Had it all been an act to manipulate him, or was she truly trying to escape the clutches of the organization? He couldn't make a move until he understood her intentions clearly. Anthony knew he had to be careful, but he needed answers. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. The line rang 3 times before a soft, familiar voice answered. "Anthony?" It was Monique. His heart raced at the sound of her voice, but he kept his tone steady. "Monique, we need to talk. Can we meet somewhere private?" There was a brief pause on the other end, and Anthony could almost hear the gears turning in her mind. "Is everything okay? I need to see you. There's something important I need to discuss," he said, forcing calmness into his voice. "All right. The park near Riverton at 9 p.m. I'll be there." As dusk settled, Anthony made his way to the park. His steps were slow, his mind still wrestling with conflicting thoughts. Could Monique have been playing him from the beginning? Or was she trying to escape the circle, like Samuel had suggested? When he arrived, the park was quiet. The soft glow of street lamps illuminated the path, and in the distance, he saw Monique waiting by the fountain, her silhouette etched against the dim light. "Anthony," she called out when she saw him approaching. He could feel the tension in the air as he walked up to her, trying to read her expression. But her face was a mask of concern and innocence, just as it had been the first night they met. If she was part of the circle, she was hiding it well. "Monique," he said, his voice steady but his gaze hard, "I know about the circle. I know you're involved." Her eyes widened, and for a split second, Anthony saw genuine fear flash across her face. She glanced around quickly, as if checking to see if anyone else was watching. "You don't understand, Anthony," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "I had no choice. The circle, they control everything. I was pulled into it before I even realized what was happening." Anthony's jaw clenched. "So, you've been lying to me this whole time? Manipulating me?" Tears welled up in Monique's eyes. "No, I never meant to hurt you. I didn't know who you were at first. When I met you that night, I was desperate, Anthony. I really was. But when I found out how connected you were to the circle's enemies, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. They would have killed me if I had backed out." Anthony's mind was spinning. He wanted to believe her, but the evidence on the USB drive told a different story. "You should have told me. We could have figured this out together." "They don't give people second chances," Monique whispered, her voice shaking. "They threaten my family, my life. I've been trying to find a way out ever since I met you." Anthony took a step back, his fists clenched. "So why now? Why tell me this now?" "Because I can't keep running, Anthony," Monique said, desperation lacing her words. "I'm trapped, and now you're in danger too. The circle knows you've been poking around. They'll come after you if we don't stop them." Anthony's stomach twisted at the confirmation of his fears. "Then what do we do?" he asked, his voice low. Monique looked around again. Her expression hardened with determination. "There's a meeting tomorrow night. The circle's leaders will be there. If we can get inside, record what they say, and leak it to the public, we might have a chance to take them down." Anthony's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but it was also the most dangerous step he would ever take. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure," Monique said. "But if we fail, it's over for both of us." The next evening, Anthony and Monique found themselves in the heart of the city, standing in front of an opulent hotel where the circle's clandestine meeting was set to take place. The building loomed above them, like a monolith of power and secrecy, its walls concealing dark and twisted schemes that had been in motion for years. Are you ready for this? Monique asked, her voice barely a whisper as they stood at the entrance. Anthony's pulse raced. No, but we don't have a choice. Monique led the way into the hotel, her demeanor calm but calculated. She had made the arrangements to get them inside under false identities, ensuring they would blend in with the other guests attending the event. As they walked through the grand foyer, the tension in the air was palpable. Men and women dressed in expensive suits and gowns filled the space, their conversations low and guarded. Anthony could see it in their faces, the same cold calculation that marked the circle's elite. "Stay close to me," Monique whispered, her hand brushing Anthony's arm. "We'll head to the ballroom. That's where the meeting is happening." They navigated through the crowd, their footsteps silent on the marble floors. Anthony's senses were on high alert, every glance and movement around them heightening his awareness of the danger they were in. As they reached the ballroom, Monique pulled a small device from her purse and handed it to Anthony. "This is the recorder. Hide it well. We can't risk being caught." Anthony slipped the device into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against it nervously. His heart pounded in his chest, but he knew there was no turning back now. The doors to the ballroom swung open, revealing a grand room filled with polished tables and crystal chandeliers. At the center of it all, a raised platform with a podium stood, waiting for the leaders of the circle to make their appearance. Anthony scanned the room, recognizing some of the faces from the files Samuel had given him. These were the people who had orchestrated deals in the shadows, pulling strings and ruining lives for their own gain. And tonight, they were all here under one roof. Monique leaned in closer to Anthony, her breath warm against his ear. "We have to be quick. We'll wait until the leaders start speaking, then record everything. After that, we get out as fast as we can." Anthony nodded, his body tense with anticipation. They were walking straight into the lion's den, and one wrong move could be the end. As they took their seats, Anthony's mind raced with questions. Would this be enough to bring the circle down? Or was this another elaborate trap waiting to spring? The ballroom grew quiet as the lights dimmed, and the leaders of the circle began to file onto the stage. Anthony braced himself for what was to come, knowing that the next few moments could change everything. The ballroom buzzed with a tense energy as the circle's leaders took their positions on the stage. The lights dimmed, and the chatter in the room died down to a murmur. Anthony and Monique sat at one of the tables near the back, trying to blend in with the crowd. Their eyes were locked on the stage, hearts pounding as they waited for the meeting to begin. Anthony subtly adjusted his jacket, feeling the weight of the recorder in his pocket. This was their moment, the chance to expose the secrets of the circle and bring them down once and for all. But as the minutes ticked by, the reality of the danger they faced crept into his mind. One wrong move, one suspicious glance, and they could both be caught. A tall man with graying hair approached the podium, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room. Anthony recognized him immediately. Jacob Forbes, one of the most powerful and influential figures in the circle. Forbes' name had come up multiple times in the files Samuel had given Anthony, tied to some of the most nefarious dealings within the organization. Forbes cleared his throat, and the room fell into complete silence. He surveyed the crowd with a cold, calculated gaze before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering here tonight. We are on the verge of one of the most important moments in our history." Anthony's pulse quickened as Forbes continued. He glanced at Monique, who gave him a small nod, signaling that she was ready. Carefully, Anthony activated the recorder in his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid drawing attention. Forbes went on, outlining the circle's next steps, plans to seize control of key financial institutions and government positions. As he spoke, it became clear that the circle's influence reached further than Anthony had ever imagined. This wasn't just about personal gain for a few powerful people. It was about global domination, controlling the very systems that shape society. "Once we solidify our position," Forbes said with a sly smile, "there will be no stopping us. Governments will bend to our will. Economies will crumble at our command." Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. The stakes were even higher than he thought. He glanced around the room, wondering if anyone else was as horrified by Forbes' words as he was. But the crowd seemed unfazed, their faces emotionless, as if this was all just business as usual. As Forbes spoke, Anthony noticed movement out of the corner of his eye. Two men dressed in black suits were slowly making their way through the crowd, their eyes scanning the room with an intensity that made Anthony's stomach churn. He nudged Monique subtly, and she followed his gaze. "There's security," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They must be checking for any suspicious activity." Anthony's heart raced. If they were caught with the recorder, it would all be over. He forced himself to remain calm, keeping his expression neutral as the men drew closer to their table. Just as they passed, the doors at the back of the ballroom burst open with a loud bang, startling everyone in the room. Several men in tactical gear stormed in, guns drawn and shouting orders. "Everyone stay where you are. This is a raid." Panic erupted in the ballroom. People scrambled from their seats, knocking over chairs and tables in their haste to escape. The leaders on stage froze in shock, their carefully controlled world crumbling before their eyes. Monique grabbed Anthony's arm, pulling him toward a side exit. "We need to go now," she shouted over the chaos. Anthony followed her, his mind racing. Who had launched the raid? Was it a rival group, or had someone else been working to bring down the circle from the inside? As they reached the exit, they were met by a group of armed officers who quickly restrained them. "Hands in the air," one of the officers barked. Anthony raised his hands, his heart sinking. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Everything had gone so wrong, so fast. But then, one of the officers stepped forward, lowering his weapon. His face was familiar. Samuel. "Anthony," Samuel said quietly, his expression serious. "We've been watching this place for weeks. We're here to bring them down, and we need your help." The world around Anthony felt like a blur. The ballroom was a storm of panic, men and women being rounded up, shouts and screams echoing off the walls. But in the midst of it all, Samuel stood calm, his eyes locked on Anthony. "Samuel, what is going on?" Anthony asked, his voice a mix of relief and confusion. "I thought you were done with all this." Samuel glanced around cautiously before answering. "I never left, Anthony. We knew the circle was planning something big, but we couldn't move in until we had enough evidence. And that's where you come in." Monique stepped forward, her voice trembling with frustration. "And you didn't think to warn us? We almost got killed." Samuel looked at her, his face betraying no emotion. "I couldn't risk tipping off the circle. They got eyes everywhere. We needed them to think everything was going according to plan. That's why we let you go in tonight." Anthony's mind was spinning. So this was all part of a larger plan. But it still didn't explain why Samuel had kept him in the dark for so long. "Why didn't you just tell me from the start?" Anthony demanded. "You let me walk into a trap?" Samuel sighed. "We didn't know if we could trust you. You were too close to everything, Monique, the money, the power. We needed to be sure you wouldn't turn on us." "I would never," Anthony began, but Samuel cut him off. "I know that now, but you have to understand, the circle has gotten to people before. They've destroyed lives. We couldn't take any chances." Anthony clenched his fists, anger and betrayal coursing through him. "So what now? You want me to help you bring them down?" Samuel nodded. "You're the key to all of this. We need the recordings you've made tonight, and any other information you have on the circle. With your help, we can finally end this." Anthony reached into his pocket, feeling the recorder still hidden there. He hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. He wanted to trust Samuel, to believe that this was the right thing to do. But after everything that had happened, it was hard to know who to trust anymore. Before he could respond, the sound of footsteps approaching caught their attention. A group of armed men, more of the circle's enforcers, stormed into the hallway, their faces twisted with rage. "Run!" Samuel shouted, drawing his gun. Anthony and Monique didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted down the corridor, their hearts pounding in their chests. The sound of gunfire echoed behind them as they turned a corner, desperate to find a way out. But as they reached a dead end, Anthony realized they were trapped. Anthony and Monique skidded to a halt as they reached the dead end of the corridor. The walls were lined with dark, ominous paintings, the floor a polished marble that seemed to mock their desperation. Anthony's breath came in ragged gasps as he frantically searched for an escape route, but all he saw were solid walls and a single door leading back to the ballroom. Monique's eyes darted around, her face pale with fear. There has to be another way out. We can't stay here. Anthony's mind raced. They couldn't go back to the ballroom. Too many enemies were closing in, and the door they had just come through would lead them directly into the line of fire. He grabbed Monique's hand and pulled her to the door at the end of the corridor, hoping it might lead somewhere useful. As they approached, the door swung open abruptly, revealing a large storage room filled with old furniture and boxes. They rushed inside, hoping to find some way to escape the looming danger. Anthony pushed a stack of boxes against the door, trying to buy them some time. "Is there another exit?" he asked Monique, his voice tense. Monique nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "There's a maintenance hatch in the ceiling. We might be able to use it to get out." Anthony followed her gaze and saw the small hatch above them. It was barely visible, camouflaged against the ceiling, but it was their best shot. He climbed on top of an old wooden crate and reached for the hatch, pulling it open with a grunt. Monique helped him, and together they managed to push it open wide enough to squeeze through. Anthony went first, pulling himself up into the narrow crawl space. Monique followed quickly, and they crawled through the dimly lit tunnel, their movements careful and deliberate. The tunnel was cramped and musty, with every turn feeling like a step further away from their troubles. Anthony's mind was racing with the realization that the circle's grip was tighter than he'd ever imagined. But there was no time for regrets. He had to focus on finding a way out and making sure that the recordings he had were safe. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged from the tunnel into a small, dimly lit room. It was a utility closet with shelves stacked high with cleaning supplies and maintenance tools. Anthony looked around, trying to orient himself. "This should lead to an exit," Monique said, her voice echoing softly in the confined space. She moved toward a door on the far side of the closet, carefully turning the handle and peering out into the hallway beyond. The hallway was quiet, but Anthony could hear faint voices and footsteps in the distance, the circle's enforcers still searching for them. Monique stepped out cautiously, and Anthony followed, his heart pounding as he looked for any signs of danger. They made their way down the hallway, staying close to the walls and moving swiftly. The hotel's opulent decor seemed surreal compared to the gravity of their situation. They passed by luxurious suites and grand ballrooms, each a stark reminder of the power and wealth that the circle wielded. Finally, they reached a service elevator at the end of the corridor. Monique pushed the call button, her hands shaking slightly. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, and they stepped inside, Anthony pressing the button for the basement level. As the elevator descended, Anthony glanced at Monique, who looked equally exhausted and worried. "We need to get these recordings to Samuel. He needs to know what we've uncovered." Monique nodded. "But we can't go back to the hotel now. They'll be looking for us." Anthony thought for a moment. "I have a safe house nearby. It's secure. We could take the recordings there and figure out our next move." The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, revealing a dimly lit basement parking garage. They stepped out and hurried toward Anthony's car, parked in a corner. He fumbled with the keys, his hands still shaking from the adrenaline. As they drove through the city, the weight of their situation pressed heavily on Anthony's shoulders. The recordings were their only hope to expose the circle's plans, but they were also a dangerous liability. He needed to protect them at all costs. Anthony and Monique arrived at the safe house just before dawn. The house was an unassuming two-story building on the outskirts of town, hidden behind tall hedges and with an alarm system that only Anthony knew how to deactivate. They parked the car and hurried inside, locking the doors behind them. Anthony led Monique through the house, which was sparsely furnished but equipped with everything they needed to stay hidden and safe. As he set up the recordings on a secure computer, Monique paced the room, her nerves evident. "What now? We have the evidence, but we still need to get it to Samuel." Anthony nodded, his mind already working on their next move. "I'll send the recordings to Samuel through a secure channel. We need to be careful. If the circle finds out where we are, they'll come after us." He quickly transferred the files from the recorder to the computer, using encrypted software to ensure the information remained secure. Monique watched anxiously, her eyes flicking to the windows and doors as if expecting an attack at any moment. Once the files were sent, Anthony took a deep breath and sat down next to Monique. "It's done. Samuel will get the information. Now we need to figure out our next steps." Monique nodded, her expression serious. "What about us? What if the circle comes after us? We need a plan." Anthony thought for a moment, his mind racing. "We'll lay low here for a few days until we know what's happening. I'll also reach out to some contacts who might be able to help us with protection. The important thing is to stay out of sight and stay safe." Monique's eyes softened with gratitude. "Thank you, Anthony. I know I put you in a dangerous position, and I appreciate everything you've done." Anthony gave her a small, reassuring smile. "We're in this together now. We'll get through it." As they settled in for the night, the weight of their situation pressed heavily on Anthony's shoulders. They had made it out of the hotel, but the danger was far from over. The Circle was a powerful and ruthless organization, and their reach extended far beyond what he had initially believed. The safe house was quiet, the only sounds coming from the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the house settling. Anthony and Monique were exhausted, their bodies heavy with the toll of the night's events. They had managed to escape the Circle's immediate grasp, but the danger was far from over. Anthony paced the living room, his mind racing through their next steps. Monique sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the window, as if expecting another raid. They had to stay alert, stay ahead of their enemies. Just as Anthony was about to start making phone calls to his contacts, a loud knock echoed through the house. Both he and Monique froze, their hearts leaping into their throats. The knock was followed by the sound of a doorbell, which seemed almost deafening in the silence. Anthony motioned for Monique to stay hidden as he moved cautiously toward the front door. He glanced through the peephole and saw a familiar face, Samuel. The relief was almost overwhelming, but Anthony knew better than to let his guard down. He opened the door slowly, peeking out to make sure no one else was around. Samuel stood there, his expression serious, but relieved to see Anthony. "Samuel," Anthony said, stepping aside to let him in. "I didn't expect you so soon." Samuel entered quickly, his eyes scanning the room before he closed the door behind him. "I had to come. The raid last night was just the beginning. We're getting reports of increased activity from the Circle's enforcers. They're on high alert, and they know someone leaked their plans." Anthony's stomach churned. "So, they're on to us?" Samuel nodded. "Yes. They're not just hunting for the leaks. They're looking for anyone who might have had access to the information. That means you and Monique are in even greater danger now." Monique stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "What's the plan? We can't just sit here and wait for them to find us." Samuel nodded in agreement. "We need to move quickly. I've arranged for a secure location where we can lay low until things cool down. It's well protected and hidden from prying eyes." Anthony frowned. "What about the recordings? We need to make sure they're safe." "I've already taken care of that," Samuel said. "I have a team working on decrypting the data and preparing it for public release. We need to get it out there, but we need to do it in a way that ensures it reaches the right people." Anthony sighed, feeling a mix of relief and frustration. "All right, let's get out of here. Where's the new location?" Samuel pulled out a map and handed it to Anthony. "It's a remote cabin in the woods, about an hour's drive from here. It's isolated and heavily guarded. I'll lead the way." As Anthony and Monique gathered their things, Samuel glanced at Anthony with a serious expression. "I need you to understand something. The Circle has a lot of resources, and they're not going to stop until they find you. We have to be smart and stay ahead of them." Anthony nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "I get it. We'll do whatever it takes." They left the safe house and got into Samuel's car, driving through the quiet streets of the city. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the landscape. Anthony glanced at Monique, who was staring out the window with a worried expression. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Monique turned to him, forcing a small smile. "I'm just thinking about everything that's happened. It's been a whirlwind, but I'm glad we're working together. It makes me feel like we have a chance." Anthony reached over and took her hand. We do. We just have to stay focused and keep moving forward. As they drove, the city gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. The journey was peaceful, but the sense of danger never fully left them. Every shadow and every rustling leaf seemed to hold a potential threat. After an hour of winding roads and dense trees, they arrived at the cabin. It was a modest, rustic building surrounded by tall pines, with a large security gate and cameras placed strategically around the property. Samuel led them inside, where they were greeted by a small team of security personnel and technicians. "This will be your home for the next few days," Samuel said, giving them a brief tour. "We have surveillance set up, and the area is secure. You'll be safe here while we work on getting the information out." Anthony and Monique settled into the cabin, feeling a mix of relief and tension. The cabin was cozy, with a large fireplace and comfortable furniture. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of the hotel, but it was a welcome refuge. As the day wore on, Anthony and Monique tried to relax and get some rest, but the looming threat of the circle weighed heavily on their minds. They knew that every minute they spent in hiding brought them one step closer to danger, but it also bought them time to turn the tide against their enemies. The first night at the cabin passed uneventfully, but Anthony and Monique were unable to shake the feeling of unease. The cabin was surrounded by dense forest, and the occasional snap of twigs or rustling of leaves made them jump. As dawn broke, Samuel arrived with a fresh batch of supplies and updates. "How's everything going?" he asked, his face showing concern. "We're managing," Anthony said, glancing around the cabin. "What's the latest?" Samuel handed Anthony a folder with new reports. "We've been tracking the circle's movements. They're stepping up their search efforts. We believe they might be using some advanced technology to locate us." Anthony's heart sank. The circle had always been a formidable enemy, but the idea that they might have high-tech resources was daunting. "What about the recordings? Any progress on getting them out?" "Yes," Samuel said, nodding. "Our team is working on it. We're coordinating with journalists and security agencies to ensure the information gets to the right people." Just then, the sound of a car approaching made everyone tense. Samuel's team quickly moved to secure the area, their eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. Anthony and Monique exchanged worried glances. The car pulled up to the cabin, and a familiar figure stepped out. Detective Jacobs, the investigator who had helped Anthony earlier in the case. His presence was unexpected and somewhat reassuring. Samuel approached Jacobs as he walked up to the cabin. "Detective Jacobs, what are you doing here?" Jacobs gave a curt nod. "I got a tip-off about your location. Thought it might be important. I have some information that might help." Anthony's curiosity was piqued. "What's going on?" Jacobs pulled out a file and handed it to Anthony. "I've been doing some digging of my own. There are connections between the circle and several high-ranking officials. They've been pulling strings behind the scenes." Anthony flipped through the file, his eyes widening at the names and details. "This is huge. Why didn't you tell us sooner?" Jacob shrugged. "I needed to confirm the information first. And with everything happening, I thought it was best to wait until I had concrete evidence." Monique looked at Jacobs with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "So, what's the plan now?" Jacobs glanced at Samuel. "I suggest we use this information to our advantage. If we can expose these connections, it will add more pressure on the circle and help us in our fight." Samuel nodded in agreement. "I think that's a solid plan. We need to move quickly and make sure we're ahead of the circle." As they discussed their next moves, Anthony felt a renewed sense of determination. With the new evidence from Jacobs and the support from Samuel, they had a chance to turn the tide. But they had to act fast. The circle was closing in, and every moment counted. The atmosphere in the cabin was charged with a sense of urgency as Anthony, Monique, Samuel, and Detective Jacobs huddled around the table, analyzing the new evidence. The connections between the circle and high-ranking officials were damning and detailed, offering a clear path to exposing the organization's corruption. "We need to get this information to the public," Samuel said, his voice filled with determination. "But we also need to ensure our safety. The circle will likely be on high alert." Jacobs nodded, adding, "I've got contacts in the media who can help. If we release this information strategically, it could cause a major scandal and weaken the Circle's grip. Anthony reviewed the evidence, his mind racing with strategies. What's our next step? First, Jacob said, we need to leak this information to a trusted journalist who can verify and publish it. Second, we need to stay on the move to avoid detection. Samuel handed Anthony a secure phone. I've arranged for a journalist who can handle this. They're expecting a call. Use this phone for all communications regarding the release. As Anthony prepared to contact the journalist, Monique approached him with a concerned expression. Are you sure this is the right move? It feels like we're risking everything. Anthony took her hand, his gaze steady. It's the only move we have. The Circle won't stop until they've silenced us. If we expose them, we might just have a chance to end this. Monique nodded, squeezing his hand in return. All right, let's do this. Anthony made the call, speaking with the journalist and providing them with the critical information. The journalist promised to act quickly and securely. With their part done, Anthony and Monique took a deep breath and prepared for the next phase of their escape. As they packed their belongings and prepared to leave the cabin, Samuel and Jacobs made final arrangements to ensure their safety. The team of security personnel would stay behind to guard the cabin and manage any potential threats. With everything in place, Anthony and Monique left the cabin and traveled to a new location arranged by Samuel. They stayed in a series of secure hideouts, moving frequently to avoid detection. Meanwhile, the journalist worked tirelessly to verify and publish the information, creating waves of media coverage that began to unravel the Circle's operations. The exposure of the Circle's corruption had a profound impact. Public outrage grew, and investigations were launched into the organization's activities. Key members of the Circle were arrested, and the high-ranking officials connected to the scandal faced intense scrutiny and legal action. Anthony and Monique watched from a safe distance, their sense of accomplishment tempered by the realization of the risks they had faced. They knew that their actions had made a difference, but the journey had been perilous. One day, as they sat in a quiet park, Samuel and Jacobs joined them for a final meeting. The Circle's power has been significantly diminished, Samuel said, but the fight for justice and transparency continues. Jacobs added, you both did an incredible job. Your courage and determination played a crucial role in bringing down a dangerous organization. Monique looked at Anthony, her eyes filled with gratitude. We couldn't have done it without you both. Thank you for everything. Anthony nodded, feeling a mix of relief and pride. We did what we had to do, but this experience has taught me a lot about the importance of standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. As life slowly returned to normal, Anthony and Monique reflected on their harrowing journey. The events had tested their resolve and courage, but they had emerged stronger and wiser. The moral of their story was clear. In the face of corruption and injustice, one's actions can have a profound impact. Standing up against wrongdoing, even when it seems impossible, can lead to meaningful change. Their bravery had exposed the Circle's sinister operations and paved the way for a more just and transparent society. They also learned that true strength lies in collaboration and trust. The support of Samuel, Jacobs, and the journalist had been instrumental in their success. Together, they had faced a formidable adversary and emerged victorious. In the end, Anthony and Monique knew that their fight was not just about their own survival, but about making the world a better place. Their story was a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of integrity, and the belief that even the smallest act of courage can lead to monumental change. And so, as they walked forward into their new lives, they carried with them the knowledge that standing up for what is right is always worth the fight. The battle against injustice may be ongoing, but their experience had shown them that change was possible, and that they had played a crucial role in making it happen.